They gave him only a rocky plot of land as a joke, but what he found floating in the river, Marcus Bennett still felt the bitter taste of humiliation fresh in his mouth as he left the notary's office that Thursday afternoon. At 47, he had just received his share of the family inheritance, 20 hectares of rocks and dry land that not even animals wanted to tread on. While his 3 younger brothers divided the houses in town, the auto repair shop, and the thriving grocery store, he got the most rejected plot of his father's property. It was the lawyer who read with barely disguised irony that the land was intended for the son who always knew how to find value where no one else saw it. The phrase echoed in Marcus's mind like a cruel joke. His younger brother Derek had even laughed out loud in front of everyone, saying that at least he could raise goats among the rocks. His sister-in-law Jennifer had whispered something about, "You reap what you sow," clearly referring to the years Marcus struggled to maintain small businesses that always failed. The land was 15 kilometers from Riverside, in the interior of Central Valley, a stretch of grey rocks cut by a creek that looked more like an open sewer. Marcus drove his 1978 van down the dirt road, feeling every pothole like a punch in the gut. The tears he had held back at the notary's office finally flowed freely as he parked under the only half-dry tree that provided shade on the property. He got out of the van and walked among the rocks, stepping on thorns that pierced the already worn soles of his boots. The silence was broken only by the sound of dirty water running between the rocks. Marcus wondered how his father had been capable of such cruelty. For 47 years, he had always been treated as the problem child, the one who couldn't get ahead in life like the others. Now, even after the old man's passing, the humiliation continued. He sat on a larger rock and watched the creek that cut across the property from end to end. The water carried trash and dry leaves, creating little whirlpools among the rocks. Marcus thought about selling that piece of junk for any price and leaving Riverside forever. Maybe in the south he could start over, far from the pitying looks and whispers about Marcus who never gets anything right. He was lost in these thoughts when something yellow caught his attention downstream. It looked like a yellow cloth or bag floating among the rocks, stuck in a bend where the water made more noise. Marcus stood up and walked along the bank, slipping on the wet rocks and holding onto dry branches to keep from falling. As he got closer, he realized it was a yellow plastic bag, the kind from supermarkets, all wet and heavy. At first, he thought about leaving it. It was probably trash thrown by someone passing on the road, but something bothered him about the way the bag was stuck there, as if it were waiting to be found. Marcus took off his red plaid shirt and stretched it out to try to hook the bag. On the 3rd try, he managed to pull it to the bank. The bag was heavy and completely soaked. Marcus opened it carefully and found dozens of wet envelopes, all addressed to the same place. St. Grace Home, Girls' Orphanage, in Hillcrest. The envelopes were in various states of decay, some completely blurred by water, others still legible. Marcus quickly counted, and there were at least 40 letters there. He opened one of the letters that was in better condition and read with growing surprise. It was from a lady named Grace Patterson from Charleston, offering monthly help of 500 rials to the orphanage and asking about the possibility of adoption. The letter was dated 3 months ago. Marcus opened another, from a businessman in Mesa, offering to donate clothes and school supplies. Another one, from a couple in Springfield wanting to adopt a girl between 8 and 10 years old. Marcus felt a tightness in his chest. All those letters were from people offering help for orphaned children, but they had never reached their destination. Someone had intercepted them and then thrown them in the river, but who would do such a thing? And why? Marcus gathered all the wet letters and carefully placed them back in the bag. He needed to find out how they had ended up there. He walked back to the van with the bag in his hands, feeling the weight of responsibility. Those letters represented hope for dozens of abandoned children, and someone had deliberately prevented them from reaching their destination. Marcus thought of the orphanage, imagining nuns or caregivers waiting for donations that never arrived, having to deny food or clothing to children due to lack of resources. He decided to go to Hillcrest that same day to deliver the letters personally. The trip would take an hour and a half in the van, but Marcus felt he couldn't wait. As he drove along the potholed country roads, 1,000 theories ran through his head. Maybe it was a postal crime, corrupt employees diverting mail, or some local resident who was angry at the orphanage for some reason. St. Grace Home was on a quiet street in Hillcrest, a two-story yellow house with a small garden in front where some girls were playing. Marcus parked in front and watched for a few minutes. The children seemed well cared for, but the house clearly needed repairs. The paint was peeling and some windows had cracked glass, patched with tape. He rang the bell and was greeted by a short nun in her 50s, with kind but tired eyes. She introduced herself as Sister Catherine and asked how she could help. Marcus explained about the letters found in the river, showing the wet bag. The nun's face changed completely, going from curiosity to shock and then to a deep sadness. "Please come in," she said, guiding Marcus to a small room with old but clean furniture. "Can you show me these letters?" Marcus opened the bag and spread the envelopes on a wooden table. Sister Catherine picked up a few letters and examined them with tears in her eyes. "We knew something was wrong," she said, her voice choked. "For months, people have been calling asking why we haven't responded to their letters offering help. Families interested in adoption complained that they sent documents and never heard back. We thought it was a postal problem, but someone was purposely intercepting them," Marcus completed. 42 girls live here," the nun continued. "We survive on donations from the community and from a few families who know our situation. But the money barely covers basic food. We've already had to turn away several girls who needed a home because we can't afford to care for more children." Marcus felt a growing anger in his chest. Someone had stolen these children's chance at a better life. Families willing to help and adopt were being prevented from finding the girls who needed them. "Do you have any idea who could have done this?" asked Marcus. "I have no idea. Our mail always arrived normally through the town post office. The mailman, Mr. Walter, is an honest man who has worked in the area for 20 years. We've never had any problems with him." Marcus promised to investigate the case and help in any way he could. Sister Catherine insisted that he stay for dinner, wanting to introduce him to the girls. During the simple meal of rice, beans and eggs, Marcus talked with some of the children. They were all affectionate and polite, but the lack of resources was visible. The uniforms were faded, the shoes were patched, and the amount of food was clearly rationed. A girl about 10 years old, named Emma, sat down next to Marcus and asked if he knew any family who wanted a daughter. "I can read and write well," she said with a hopeful smile, "and I know how to help in the kitchen and take care of the younger girls. I would be a good daughter for someone." Marcus's heart broke. He returned to Riverside that night, determined to find out who was behind the theft of the letters. He spent the entire early morning examining the wet envelopes, looking for clues. Some had postmarks from different cities: Charleston, Mesa, Springfield, Riverside. Others had common stamps indicating they were mailed normally. The next morning, Marcus went to the Riverside post office to speak with the mail carrier responsible for the orphanage area. Mr. Walter was a thin man of about 60, with a grey mustache and a suspicious manner. When Marcus asked about mail for St. Grace Home, the man became visibly nervous. "Son, I deliver the mail properly to the address written on it. If they're not receiving it, the problem isn't with me," said Walter, avoiding looking directly at Marcus. "I'm not accusing anyone," Marcus tried to calm him. "I'm just trying to understand how so many letters ended up in the river." "River? What river?" Marcus realized he had said too much. He didn't want to spread the story before he better understood what was happening. He made up an excuse about trash found on the property and left, but he noticed that Walter remained nervous. That same day, Marcus decided to return to the land to look for more evidence. If someone had thrown those letters in the river, maybe there were other things hidden around there. He spent hours walking along the creek banks, rummaging among the stones and observing every bend where something could have gotten stuck. In the late afternoon, when the sun was already low, he found something that took his breath away. In a tighter bend of the river, where the waters formed a small pool among the rocks, there was another object stuck. A brown leather bag, old and soaked. Marcus fished it out with a branch and opened it carefully. Inside was an identification card for a man named Anthony Morrison, 72 years old, and dozens of other wet envelopes. But this time, they weren't letters for the orphanage. They were correspondence addressed to a nursing home in Meadowbrook, a public hospital in Riverdale, and a school for underprivileged children in Pleasant Grove, all offering donations, volunteering, medical equipment, and school supplies. Marcus sat on a rock trying to process what he was discovering. It wasn't just the orphanage being harmed. Someone was systematically intercepting mail destined for various charity institutions in the region. But who was Anthony Morrison, and what was his connection to the scheme? He checked the address on the ID and found that the man lived in a small house on the outskirts of Riverside. Marcus decided to visit him the next day to return the wallet and try to understand his connection to the lost letters. Perhaps he was a victim like the institutions, or perhaps he knew something about who was behind it all. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we are just starting out, now continuing. Anthony Morrison's house was on a dirt road in one of the outskirts of Riverside, a collection of simple houses where most residents worked at the market or in small businesses. Marcus knocked on the peeling wooden door and was greeted by an elderly man, thin and stooped, who walked with difficulty leaning on a cane. "Are you Anthony Morrison?" asked Marcus, showing the wet wallet. The old man's face changed completely. His eyes filled with tears and he began to tremble. "Where did you find this, son? Please come in quickly before anyone sees you." Anthony led Marcus into the house, a small room with old furniture and several family photos on the walls. The man was visibly nervous, looking out the window as if expecting someone to appear. 3 years ago I worked as a postal service assistant, Anthony began with a trembling voice. I was retired, but I needed extra income to buy my wife's medicine. My job was to sort and organize mail for different delivery routes. Marcus listened attentively as the old man continued. One day I noticed something strange. Mail destined for orphanages, hospitals, and other charitable institutions began to disappear before delivery. At first I thought it was a coincidence, but when I saw it always happened with letters that seemed to contain donations or offers of help, I started to investigate. And what did you find out? I found out that someone was paying postal workers to divert these letters. They specifically chose envelopes that seemed to contain money or donation offers. The letters were taken out of the system before they even reached the mail carriers. Marcus felt a knot in his stomach. "And you reported it?" "I tried," said Anthony, lowering his voice. "But when I went to speak with my supervisor, I discovered he was also involved. They offered me money to stay quiet, but I refused. I said I was going to go to the authorities." "What happened then?" "They threatened me. They said I was an old man no one would believe, and that if I said anything, my family would suffer the consequences. My wife was very sick at the time. She needed special care. I couldn't take the risk." The old man paused to wipe his eyes with an old handkerchief. "Even so, I started secretly gathering evidence. I took copies of the mail lists, noted down the names of the letters that disappeared. I wanted to gather enough proof to report the whole scheme at once. And that evidence was in the bag. Yes, I always carried it with me, afraid to leave it at home. But 2 weeks ago, when I was returning from the doctor with my wife, we were robbed. They took the bag with everything inside. My wife got very ill from the shock and she didn't make it. She passed a week ago." Marcus felt a lump in his throat. This man had lost his wife and all the evidence that could bring justice. "Mr. Anthony, I found your bag in a river on my property. The evidence is wet, but maybe it can still be used." The old man's eyes shone with a mixture of hope and fear. "Son, you don't understand the danger you're getting into. These people don't mess around. They've killed for much less." Marcus felt a chill, but his indignation was greater than his fear. "Mr. Anthony, we can't let this go. There are orphaned children in need because of these criminals, sick people who don't receive medicine, abandoned elderly." "I know, son. That's why I tried to do something. But I'm just an old man with no resources. Do you have a family? Children?" "I have no one," replied Marcus, "and maybe that's exactly why I need to do something." Anthony was silent for a few minutes, thinking. Finally, he looked at Marcus with determination. "If you really want to help, you need to know the scheme is bigger than you imagine. It's not just a few corrupt postal workers. There are businessmen involved, influential people in the region. How so? The stolen letters aren't just ignored. They use the information for their own benefit. When a company offers a donation to an orphanage, they intercept it and make direct contact, pretending to represent the institution. They get the donations for themselves. Marcus felt a wave of nausea. The wickedness of those people knew no bounds. And when families offer to adopt? That's even worse. They contact families, claim to represent the orphanage, and charge illegal fees to speed up the adoption process. Many families pay thousands of rials thinking they will adopt a child, but they never manage to complete the process. Marcus was shocked. It was a criminal scheme that caused suffering on all ends. Children who lost the chance to have a home, institutions left without resources, and families who were deceived and robbed. Mr. Anthony, do you still have any evidence? Names, documents, anything? The old man got up with difficulty and went to an old cabinet in the bedroom. He returned with a shoebox tied with string. I managed to hide a few things before I lost my job. They are copies of lists, notes I made, and some names I discovered. Marcus opened the box and found dozens of handwritten papers. Anthony had meticulously documented dates, names of senders, recipient institutions, and amounts mentioned in the stolen letters. There were also some names of people involved in the scheme. This one is Richard Stevens, the post office supervisor. This is Frank Carson, a businessman who owns a transport company and helps with the scheme. And this one, Anthony hesitated, this is Dr. Henry Armstrong, a very well-known lawyer in the region. Marcus knew the name. Henry Armstrong was one of the most respected lawyers in Riverside, always involved in social actions and charity campaigns. Seeing his name on that list was shocking. Are you sure about this one? I am. He's the one who coordinates the fake adoption part. He uses his prestige to gain families' trust. He's the one who receives the payments and then disappears with the money. Marcus photographed all the documents with his old cell phone, making sure he had copies of everything. He promised Anthony he would keep his identity secret and try to expose the scheme safely. Son, be very careful, warned the old man. If they find out you're investigating, they'll try to stop you at any cost. Marcus returned to his rocky plot of land with his mind buzzing with plans. He had enough evidence to start acting, but he needed to be smart. If he confronted the criminals directly, they would simply deny everything and destroy what little evidence remained. He needed a better strategy. He spent the night organizing all the information he had. The wet letters from the river, Anthony's documents, the names of those involved. It was clear the scheme had been operating for years, harming hundreds of people. Marcus felt he had finally found a purpose in life, something worth fighting for. The next morning he decided to start by discreetly visiting some of the institutions mentioned in the stolen letters. He wanted to confirm that they were also facing problems with donations that never arrived. If he could document the pattern across several institutions, he would have a stronger case. His first stop was the public hospital in Riverdale. The director, Dr. Karen Williams, was a 50-year-old woman with a tired but determined air. And when Marcus vaguely explained about missing correspondence, she sighed deeply. Son, you have no idea how much this problem affects us. Pharmaceutical companies, NGOs, private individuals, everyone offers help by mail, but the vast majority never materializes. How so? They send letters promising donations of medicine, equipment, money for renovations. Sometimes they even call to confirm they sent the correspondence, but we never receive anything. We thought it was people being disorganized, making empty promises. And you never suspected the letters might be intercepted. Honestly, it never crossed our minds. Who would do such a thing? Steal help meant for the sick? Marcus felt he was on the right track. He visited the school in Pleasant Grove and heard a similar story. The director explained that for 2 years she had been waiting for a computer donation promised by a company, but it never arrived. Several families had offered school supplies and uniforms, but nothing ever came. The nursing home in Meadowbrook was the most impactful. The director, Mr. Joseph Charles, was a 70-year-old man who had dedicated his life to caring for abandoned elderly. He cried as he told of the unfulfilled promises. Son, you can't imagine what it's like to see an old man waiting for a wheelchair that never comes, or a lady who needs a blanket in the winter, and the promised donation just disappears. We call the people who sent the letters, and they swear they fulfilled their promise. Marcus was beginning to understand the scale of the suffering caused by the criminal scheme. It wasn't just money being stolen, it was dreams being destroyed, lives being harmed, hope being stolen from those who had already lost almost everything. He decided it was time to start acting more directly. First, he personally took the letters recovered from the river to St. Grace Home. Sister Catherine was moved to see families interested in adoption and companies offering substantial donations. "Marcus, you have no idea of the good you're doing. This letter here is from a couple from Charleston who want to adopt twin sisters. We have the girls Grace and Faith, 9 years old, who have never been separated. It would be perfect for them." Marcus helped the nun contact several families and companies mentioned in the letters. To his surprise, all confirmed they had sent correspondence to the orphanage months ago, and were outraged to learn it had never arrived. Some had already tried other forms of contact, but without success. While helping to reconnect willing people with needy institutions, Marcus began to investigate the criminal scheme more deeply. He used Anthony's information to discreetly observe the suspects and map out how they operated. He discovered that Richard Stevens, the postal supervisor, had a lifestyle well above his salary. He lived in a large house, drove an imported car, and frequented expensive restaurants. For someone earning a public servant's salary, he was clearly living on money from other sources. Frank Carson, the owner of the transport company, also raised suspicions. His business had grown a lot in recent years, securing lucrative contracts with several city halls in the region. Marcus discovered that many of the intercepted donations were redirected through Frank's transport company, which charged absurd fees to deliver donations that were theoretically free. The hardest to investigate was Dr. Henry Armstrong. The lawyer maintained an impeccable facade of respectability, participating in charity events and social campaigns. But Marcus noticed something interesting. Henry always offered to help families with complicated adoption processes, charging extra fees to expedite procedures that should be free. Marcus decided to set a trap. Using a borrowed phone, he posed as a family interested in adopting a child and contacted Henry's office. The lawyer immediately offered his services, promising to expedite the process for a fee of $5,000. "Doctor, we've already tried direct contact with some orphanages, but it seems our correspondence got lost," said Marcus, pretending to be the husband interested in adoption. "Oh, that's very common," replied Henry with suspicious ease. "The mail system is very flawed. That's why I offer a direct service without intermediaries. I guarantee that in 60 days you'll have a child." Marcus recorded the entire conversation on his phone. It was clear evidence that Henry was offering illegal services, promising to expedite processes that should follow specific legal procedures. But Marcus knew he needed more evidence before exposing the scheme. If he acted hastily, the criminals could destroy evidence and escape unpunished. He decided to continue investigating, carefully documenting each discovery. That's when he made his first mistake. One afternoon, while discreetly observing the post office, he was noticed by Richard Stevens. The supervisor stared at him through the window, and Marcus realized he had been identified. He quickly left the location, but knew he had lost the element of surprise. The next morning, Marcus found his van with slashed tires and a note on the windshield. "Stop sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." It was a clear warning that the criminals knew about his investigations. Marcus was nervous, but not intimidated. If they were trying to scare him, it meant he was on the right track. He fixed the tires and decided to accelerate his investigations before the crooks took more drastic measures. He sought out Anthony Morrison again and told him about the threat. The old man was worried. "I warned you, son. They don't mess around. Maybe it's best you hand everything over to the authorities and let them handle it. Mr. Anthony, after everything you've told me, do you trust the authorities? What if they're involved too?" The old man sighed. He knew Marcus was right. In small towns, corruption often involved various spheres of public power. "So what do you intend to do?" "I'm going to expose everything publicly. I'll take the evidence to journalists, to the community, to the affected families themselves. I'll make so much noise they won't be able to cover it up. Marcus spent the next few days organizing a complete dossier of the criminal scheme. He included all the recovered letters, Anthony's documents, photos of the suspects, recordings of conversations, and testimonies from the harmed institutions. It was meticulous work that clearly showed how the scheme worked and who was involved. He also began contacting people who had been deceived by the criminals. He found several families who had paid illegal fees to Henry Armstrong, hoping to speed up adoption processes that never materialized. Business owners who had delivered donations to Frank Carson's transport company and later discovered they never reached the recipients. One of the most touching stories was that of Mrs. Margaret, a 70-year-old woman from Charleston who had tried to adopt 2 orphaned sisters after her only daughter left. She paid $8,000 to Henry Armstrong, sold her family jewelry to cover what he called urgency fees. 2 years later, she was still waiting for news about the adoption. "Son, that man promised me that in 3 months I would have my girls at home," Margaret told him with tears in her eyes. "I sold everything of value I had because I thought I would finally have someone to care for in my old age, and they would have a grandmother who would love them very much." Marcus felt anger grow in his chest with each story he heard. Those criminals weren't just stealing money, they were destroying families and preventing children from finding loving homes. He decided it was time to act. He arranged a meeting with an investigative journalist from the region's main newspaper, a man named Charles Harrington, who had a reputation for honesty and the courage to confront corruption. Marcus presented all the evidence he had collected. Charles was impressed with the quantity and quality of the evidence. "Marcus, this is explosive. If it's all true, we're going to bring down some very important people. I am absolutely certain of everything I'm presenting, and I have witnesses willing to confirm it. The problem is that some of these names have a lot of power in the region. Henry Armstrong, for example, is a personal friend of the mayor and has influence in several public agencies. He could try to sue the newspaper for defamation. That's why I brought solid evidence, recordings, documents, witnesses. He won't be able to deny it." Charles promised to investigate further and publish a special feature if he confirmed all the information. Marcus left the meeting hopeful, but knew it was still too early to celebrate. On the way home, he noticed a black car that seemed to be following him. He changed routes several times and the car stayed behind. Marcus accelerated the van and managed to lose it on a dirt road, but it was clear he was being watched. He arrived at the rocky lot after dark and noticed someone had been there. His makeshift tent was overturned and some belongings were missing. More worryingly, he found another note, this time more threatening. "Last chance. Get out of here or you'll regret it." Marcus felt fear for the first time, but also an even greater determination. If they were trying to intimidate him, it meant he was close to exposing the truth. He couldn't give up now, when so many people were depending on him to do the right thing. He decided not to sleep on the lot that night. He went to a cheap hotel in downtown Riverside and called Charles Harrington, telling him about the threats. The journalist was concerned. "Marcus, maybe it's better for you to step away for a few days. I can take over the investigation from here." "No, I want to see this through, but we need to speed up. The more time we give them, the more chance they have to destroy evidence or harm other people." Charles agreed to publish the story in Sunday's edition, 3 days away. Marcus spent the time helping to confirm information and contacting more witnesses. Every person he spoke to confirmed the patterns of the criminal scheme. On the eve of publication, Marcus received an unexpected call. It was Richard Stevens, the post office supervisor. "Marcus Bennett, we need to talk, urgently." "We have nothing to talk about," replied Marcus. "You don't understand the situation you're creating for yourself. There are very powerful people involved in this story. They can make your life hell. My life is already hell. At least now I'm doing something worthwhile. Listen carefully. They're offering 50,000 Rs for you to disappear from the city and forget everything you've discovered. It's a generous offer." Marcus almost laughed. 50,000 for me to let orphaned children remain homeless and the sick go without medicine. Take that offer to someone else." "You'll regret this decision," said Richard before hanging up. Marcus was nervous but determined. On Sunday morning, he went to the nearest newsstand and bought several copies of the edition that would change everything. The headline was devastating. Criminal scheme diverts donations intended for orphans and the sick in the region. Charles Harrington's article was thorough and devastating. It showed how the scheme worked, named everyone involved, and included testimonies from several victims. The photographs of the wet letters found in the river clearly illustrated the cruelty of the criminals. The repercussion was immediate and overwhelming. Marcus's phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from other newspapers, radio and television stations wanting more information. People from the community expressed outrage and offered help to identify other victims of the scheme. But the criminals' reaction was also swift. Henry Armstrong filed a lawsuit against the newspaper alleging defamation, but the evidence was so solid he couldn't get an injunction to stop circulation. Richard Stevens simply disappeared, requesting indefinite medical leave. Frank Carson closed the trucking company temporarily, citing administrative problems. Marcus became a public figure overnight. He was constantly sought after by reporters and activists who wanted to know more details of the investigation. He also received dozens of calls from people sharing similar stories from other regions, indicating the scheme could be even bigger. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing, the police station in Riverside was forced to open a formal investigation into the allegations. The police chief, Dr. Frank Fields, was known for his honesty and even sought out Marcus personally to thank him for exposing the scheme. "Son, you did a better job than many professional investigators. This evidence is solid and will allow us to prosecute everyone involved." Marcus felt relieved to see that at least part of the public authority was on the side of justice. He handed over all the original evidence for the official investigation, keeping only copies for himself. The impact on the charitable institutions was immediate and positive. St. Grace Home received an avalanche of donations from people outraged by what had happened. Families who had given up on adoption after being deceived resumed the process through the proper legal channels. Sister Catherine called Marcus, crying with emotion. "Marcus, in 1 week we've received more donations than in the entire year, and we already have 5 adoptions being processed correctly. You've restored hope to so many families." The hospital in Riverdale also benefited. Pharmaceutical companies that had previously attempted to make donations sent medicines and equipment directly, without going through suspicious intermediaries. The school in Pleasant Grove received new computers and school supplies from several companies moved by the story. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Marcus began to face pressure from influential people in the region who had connections to the exposed criminals. Some important clients cancelled contracts with companies that had publicly supported him. There were attempts to discredit his allegations, claiming he had personal motivations. Henry Armstrong himself tried to turn the tables, giving interviews where he presented himself as a victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by a man bitter with life. He even insinuated that Marcus had fabricated evidence to get revenge on a society that never accepted him. Marcus was shaken by the attacks on his reputation, but received unexpected support from people he had known for years. Former co-workers, neighbors, and even some of the brothers who had humiliated him during the inheritance division came forward publicly to defend his honesty. Derek, the youngest brother, sought out Marcus personally to apologize. "Bro, all our lives we thought you were kind of lost, that you couldn't succeed at anything, but now I see you were just waiting to find something truly worthwhile." It was an emotional moment for Marcus. For the first time in his life, he felt he had the respect of his family and community, not for having made money or achieved business success, but for having done the right thing when it was necessary. The police investigation advanced quickly. Richard Stevens was located trying to leave the country with false documents and cash. During interrogation, he provided complete details of the scheme in exchange for a reduced sentence. His revelations implicated more people, including other public officials and business people. Frank Carson was also arrested when he tried to destroy incriminating documents at his company. The investigation of his computers revealed a network of contacts operating the scheme in several towns in the Central Valley interior and even in other states. The most complex case was that of Henry Armstrong. As an influential lawyer, he had the resources to defend himself and try to discredit the evidence. He hired the best criminal defense lawyers in the region and filed several lawsuits trying to halt the progress of the investigations. But the number of victims who came forward to testify against him was overwhelming. In addition to the families deceived by the fake adoptions, there were cases of people who had been convinced to invest in non-existent social projects. Henry had used his reputation to run scams in various sectors. One of the most heart-wrenching victims was Mrs. Grace, an 80-year-old lady who had lost her life savings. Henry convinced her to invest in building a home for needy seniors, promising she would be one of the first beneficiaries when she grew older. She handed over 50,000 reais and never saw the money again. Dr. Henry seemed like such an upright man, she recounted in an emotional testimony. He spoke beautifully about helping the needy, showed photos of construction projects he claimed to be building. How could I suspect such a respected lawyer? Marcus attended all the trials, serving as the key witness in several cases. Seeing the criminals being convicted one by one gave him a deep satisfaction. It wasn't just justice being served, but the assurance that other people wouldn't be harmed by the same schemes. Richard Stevens was sentenced to 8 years in prison for forming a criminal organization and embezzlement. Frank Carson received 10 years for the same crimes, aggravated by money laundering. Henry Armstrong, as the mastermind of the scheme, was sentenced to 15 years in prison, in addition to having to repay all identified victims. During the trials, many surprising revelations came to light. The scheme had been operating for over 10 years and had harmed thousands of people. The embezzled money amounted to millions of reais, which were used to finance the criminals' luxurious lifestyle and invest in other illicit businesses. One of the most shocking discoveries was that Marcus's own rocky land had been used as a dumping ground for evidence. The river that ran through the property was considered a perfect place to get rid of incriminating documents, as it was isolated, and the current would carry everything away. Ironically, commented Detective Frank Fields, the place they chose to hide their crimes was exactly where they would be discovered. If Marcus hadn't inherited that land, and hadn't been curious enough to investigate what he found, perhaps we would never have uncovered the scheme. Marcus realized that the useless inheritance he had received as a humiliation had become the instrument of his redemption. The rocky land that nobody wanted was the place where he found his true purpose in life. With the end of the trials, Marcus decided what to do with his new life. The beneficiary institutions came together to create a gratitude fund, offering him a substantial sum in recognition of his courage. Marcus accepted only enough to live modestly and donated the rest to fund a donation tracking system that would ensure similar cases wouldn't happen again. He transformed the rocky land into an NGO dedicated to transparently and safely connecting donors with institutions in need. The place once considered useless became a center of hope, where people willing to help found safe ways to make a difference. Sister Catherine became a partner in managing the NGO, bringing her experience in childcare. Anthony Morrison, despite his advanced age, offered to help as a consultant, using his knowledge of criminal schemes to identify potential fraud. "Marcus," said Anthony in one of the organization's meetings, "you transformed the tragedy of my wife and my humiliation into something positive. She would be proud to know our struggle wasn't in vain." The NGO grew rapidly, attracting volunteers and collaborators from across the region. Marcus discovered he had a natural talent for coordinating social projects, something he had never noticed in his previous businesses that always failed. "It's just that now you've found something you truly believe in," Derek explained during one of his visits to the property. "Before you were trying to make money, now you want to make a difference. That changes everything." The NGO's most exciting project was the creation of a transparent adoption system where families interested in adopting children were connected directly with legitimate orphanages, with free legal support and total transparency throughout the entire process. In 2 years, over 200 children found homes through the system. Marcus also developed a tracked donations program where every contribution was documented from its origin to its final destination, with regular reports for donors on how their resources were being used. The system became a model for other regions of the country. Marcus's story gained national attention when a television network produced a documentary about how a useless property had become an instrument of social justice. The program showed the before and after of several benefited institutions and families who managed to adopt children through the NGO. One of the most striking scenes of the documentary showed the very river where it all began. The waters that once carried stolen letters now nourished a small community garden that Marcus had created on the property. Children from the orphanage came regularly to help with the planting and play among the stones that once seemed useless. Funny how life works, Marcus reflected in the documentary's final interview. I spent 47 years thinking I was a failure because I couldn't make money like my brothers. But in the end, I discovered my worth wasn't in accumulating wealth, but in using what I had to help others. Marcus's personal transformation was visible to everyone who knew him. The bitter, humiliated man had become a confident and respected person, not because he had become rich or famous, but because he had found peace with himself by doing something he considered truly important. In the following years, the NGO expanded its activities to other areas. They created a support program for abandoned seniors, a system for distributing medicine to people in need, and even a financial education project to prevent people from being deceived by scammers. Marcus became a frequent speaker at events about social responsibility, always telling his story as an example that it's never too late to find a purpose in life. His talks were especially popular among people who felt like failures or without direction. The mistake I made for decades, he often said in his presentations, was measuring my worth by the wrong ruler. I thought I had to succeed in business to be respected. But true success came when I stopped thinking about myself and started thinking about how I could be useful to others. One of the most touching stories Marcus often told was about Emma, the girl from the orphanage who had asked if he knew any family who wanted a daughter. Through the NGO, she had been adopted by a couple of teachers from Charleston who loved her as their own. Marcus, she wrote in a letter 2 years after the adoption, you gave me the family I dreamed of. Now I have a father, a mother, grandparents, and even a baby brother. Thank you for not giving up when you found those letters in the river. Marcus kept that letter as his greatest treasure, more valuable than any wealth he could have accumulated in conventional business. The rocky terrain had been completely transformed. Where before there had been only rocks and dry earth, there were now small wooden structures housing the NGO's different projects. The river was clean with fish and aquatic plants. Children played where before there had been only desolation. Frequent visitors included government authorities who wanted to learn about the transparency model developed by the NGO, journalists documenting success stories in social action, and ordinary people inspired by Marcus's transformation story. But Marcus always made a point of keeping his feet on the ground. I'm not a hero, he used to say. I'm just an ordinary man who was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time and chose to do the right thing. Anthony Morrison, who had become a kind of informal advisor to the NGO, always disagreed with this modesty. Marcus, anyone could have found those letters in the river, but only you had the courage to investigate, to face powerful criminals and to dedicate your life to correcting the injustices you uncovered. The partnership with Sister Catherine strengthened over the years. The nun moved into a small house on the grounds from where she coordinated programs related to children and families. Her experience and wisdom perfectly complemented Marcus's determination and energy. God works in mysterious ways, she used to say. He used a man who felt rejected by his family to become the father of hundreds of orphaned children, the adoptive grandfather of thousands of people in need. Marcus never married or had biological children, but he considered himself the father of all the children who had found families through the NGO and the grandfather of all those born after those successful adoptions. On special occasions, dozens of families would gather on the grounds to celebrate, creating an atmosphere of festivity and gratitude. One of the most memorable moments in the NGO's history happened 5 years after its founding, when Marcus received an unexpected visit. It was Henry Armstrong, the corrupt lawyer who had been released after serving part of his sentence for good behavior. Marcus tensed at the arrival of the man who had caused so much suffering, but Henry did not come in a belligerent attitude. He was visibly aged, thin, with the appearance of someone who had been through great hardship. "Marcus," he said with a choked voice, "I know I have no right to be here, but I needed to speak with you." "What do you want, Henry?" "I want to ask for forgiveness and I want to help." Marcus was surprised. "Help how?" "In the last few years in prison, I had time to think about everything I did. The suffering I caused, the families I destroyed, the children I prevented from finding loving homes. I can no longer live with this weight on my conscience." Henry said he had lost everything: his house, his possessions, his reputation, his family. His wife had filed for divorce, and his children refused to speak to him. He was living in a small studio apartment and working as a janitor to survive. "I know I can't undo the wrong I did," he continued, "but I would like to use what remains of my life to try to repair at least some of the damage. I know all the schemes that exist in the region. I know how the criminals operate. I can help the NGO identify and prevent other frauds." Marcus was silent for several minutes, processing the proposal. Sister Catherine, who had witnessed the conversation, approached. "Marcus, forgiveness is part of the healing, not for him but for us. If he truly wants to redeem himself, perhaps we should give him a chance." Marcus looked at Henry, seeing a broken man who seemed genuinely remorseful. He decided it was worth a try. "All right, Henry, you can help, but under some conditions. First, any work you do here will be voluntary without payment. Second, you will publicly disclose everything you know about other schemes, even if it harms people you consider friends. Third, any sign that you are trying to deceive me or harm the NGO and you are out permanently." Henry accepted all the conditions without hesitation. In the following months, he became a valuable collaborator, using his knowledge of the criminal world to help the NGO identify potential frauds before they caused damage. His involvement resulted in the exposure of 2 more minor schemes that were beginning to operate in the region. Henry's redemption became another remarkable aspect of the NGO's story. Marcus began using the case as an example in his lectures on forgiveness and second chances, showing that even people who have committed serious crimes can transform if given the opportunity and genuine willingness. "I'm not saying we should blindly trust those who have harmed us," Marcus would clarify. "But if someone demonstrates true remorse and a willingness to repair the harm they've done, perhaps we should give redemption a chance." Henry's work was crucial in preventing other families from being deceived by similar schemes. He created a warning signs manual that helped people identify potential frauds in adoption processes and donations. The material was distributed for free throughout the region. As the years passed, Marcus became increasingly recognized as a reference in transparency and ethics in social projects. He received several awards and honors, but he always made sure to share the recognition with the entire NGO team. "I was just the first to find the letters in the river," he would say. But it was hundreds of people who turned that discovery into real changes in the lives of thousands. The NGO had become a model for similar organizations across the country. Delegations would regularly come to learn about the methods developed on the stony ground and adapt them to their local realities. Marcus always welcomed these visits with enthusiasm, freely sharing all the accumulated knowledge. One of the NGO's most ambitious projects was the creation of a national transparency network, connecting social organizations from across the country to share information about reliable donors, warn about potential frauds, and facilitate the exchange of experiences. Marcus frequently traveled to other states to present the model and help implement similar systems. He always returned energized from these trips, bringing new ideas and inspiring stories of people dedicated to making a difference. "It's amazing how there are good people everywhere," he would comment after these journeys. The problem was never a lack of people willing to help. The problem was a lack of reliable systems to connect those who want to help with those who need help. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we are just starting out. Now continuing. Marcus's decade leading the NGO was marked by constant growth and increasing impact. What began as an attempt to deliver some wet letters had become an organization with over 100 volunteers and projects in dozens of cities. But Marcus began to feel the weight of the years. At 58, he had dedicated an entire decade of his life to intense social work. Although he loved what he did, he began to think about training successors, to ensure the organization's continuity. Sister Catherine, now 70 years old, was also beginning to show signs of weariness. Together, they began a gradual process of transferring responsibilities to younger volunteers who had demonstrated dedication and competence over the years. One of these young leaders was Michelle Stevens, a 30-year-old social worker who had joined the NGO after being moved by Marcus's story. Michelle had energy, innovative ideas, and a genuine passion for social work that reminded people of Marcus himself in his early years of activism. "Michelle, you remind me of myself when I discovered the first letters," said Marcus in a conversation about the organization's future. "You have that same outrage at injustice and that same determination to do something about it." Michelle felt honored by the comparison, but also intimidated by the responsibility. "Marcus, how can I replace someone who has become a living legend? People come here to meet you, not just any social worker." "Michelle, I don't want to be replaced. I want to be multiplied. The NGO cannot depend forever on just one person. It needs to transform into a solid institution that survives and prospers regardless of who is in leadership." The transition process was carefully planned and executed over 2 years. Marcus gradually passed his responsibilities to Michelle and other young leaders, remaining as an advisor and representative at important events. One of the last major initiatives directly led by Marcus was the creation of a transparency museum on the Rocky Land. The space documented the history of the criminal scheme uncovered, the investigation and trial process, and the growth of the NGO over the years. The museum included the original letters found in the river, photographs of the criminals and their convictions, testimonies from victims who received justice, and success stories of families reunited through the NGO. It was both a memorial to the injustices of the past and a celebration of the achievements attained. The museum's inauguration was an emotional event that brought together hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the NGO's work. Families who had adopted children, elderly people who had received care, institutions that had been helped, and even some of the criminals who had redeemed themselves were present. Marcus gave the inaugural speech on a sunny morning, standing beside the river that had changed his life. The words came out filled with emotion from someone who had found his true purpose. "This place was considered the most useless piece of land on my family's property," he began. "My brothers gave me these rocks as a joke, thinking they were humiliating me one last time. But it was exactly here among these useless rocks that I found the meaning of my life." The audience listened in respectful silence, many with tears in their eyes. "I discovered that value is not in what we possess, but in what we do with what we possess. This rocky land taught me that there are no useless places, only people who haven't yet discovered how to use what they have." Marcus spoke about all the people who had contributed to the transformation: Anthony Morrison, who had the courage to keep evidence even when afraid; Sister Catherine, who brought wisdom and compassion; the journalist Charles Harrington, who had the courage to publish the truth; and hundreds of volunteers who dedicated time and energy to help others. Alone, I would have achieved nothing. It took an entire community to turn an accidental discovery into a force for good. At the end of the speech, Marcus officially announced his transition to the role of advisor, passing executive leadership to Michelle Stevens. It was a symbolic moment of renewal and continuity. Michelle assumed leadership with humility and determination. Under her direction, the NGO expanded its activities even further, incorporating new technologies to increase the transparency and efficiency of its operations. They created an app that allowed real-time tracking of donations, a video call system to facilitate remote adoptions, and an online platform to connect volunteers with specific projects. Marcus observed these innovations with paternal pride. "This is how it should be," he commented to Sister Catherine. "Each generation must build upon what the previous one left behind, but always bringing new ideas and better ways of doing things." At 60, Marcus finally began to think about his own personal life. During the years dedicated to the NGO, he had completely set aside any thoughts of romantic relationships or starting his own family. But now, with more free time, he began to feel a loneliness that his work had masked. It was during a routine visit to St. Grace Home that Marcus met Claire Henderson, a 55-year-old psychologist who had started doing volunteer work with the orphaned girls. Claire was a widow, mother of 2 grown children, and had dedicated herself to volunteering after retirement. What began as casual conversations about the work with the children gradually turned into something deeper. Claire admired Marcus's dedication to the social cause, while he felt inspired by her kindness and wisdom in dealing with traumatized children. "Marcus," Claire said in one of these conversations, "you've dedicated so much time taking care of everyone else that you forgot to take care of yourself. When was the last time you thought about your own happiness?" It was a question Marcus didn't know how to answer. He had found deep satisfaction in social work, but Claire was right. He had completely neglected his personal life. The relationship between them developed slowly, with the respect and care typical of people who had lived long enough to value genuine connections. Marcus discovered it was possible to maintain his commitment to the social cause while also cultivating meaningful personal relationships. Claire brought a different perspective to Marcus's life. As a psychologist, she helped him better understand his own motivations and process the decades of family humiliation that had led him to seek validation through social work. "Marcus, you don't have to prove anything to anyone anymore," she said in a deep conversation about his past. "You've already demonstrated your worth in every possible way. Now you can simply be happy." The relationship with Claire helped Marcus find a better balance between his social vocation and his personal life. They married in a simple ceremony on the rocky land, attended by the children from the orphanage, NGO volunteers, and even some of Marcus's brothers who had reconciled with him over the years. Derek, the younger brother who had mocked Marcus's inheritance, gave an emotional speech during the ceremony. "Marcus, I spent years thinking you were the family failure because you couldn't make money like the rest of us. Today, I see you are the only one who truly succeeded, because you found something more valuable than money. You found a purpose." The marriage of Marcus and Claire was another chapter of renewal and personal growth in a life that had been completely transformed. They moved into a simple house built on the rocky land, from where Marcus could continue overseeing the NGO's work without being overwhelmed by daily responsibilities. Claire brought her psychology skills to the organization, creating emotional support programs for children awaiting adoption and families going through the process. Her work perfectly complemented the other services offered, creating a more complete system of care. "It's incredible how life has its cycles," reflected Marcus in a conversation with Anthony Morrison, who at 85 still regularly visited the NGO. "I started alone and bitter, found a purpose that gave me meaning, and now I've found someone to share it all with." Anthony smiled. "Marcus, you've always been a lucky man. It just took you a while to realize it." Marcus's later years were marked by a deep sense of fulfillment and peace. He saw the NGO thriving under new leadership, maintained healthy relationships with his family, and had found personal love in his maturity. The man who once considered himself a failure had built a legacy that would benefit future generations. The rocky land he received as a humiliation had become a symbol of hope for thousands of people. The stones that once seemed useless now supported buildings housing social projects. The river that once carried evidence of crimes now fed gardens where children played. Marcus often walked the grounds in the mornings, observing the movement of volunteers, the coming and going of families visiting the NGO, the children running among the trees they had planted over the years. It was a panorama of life and hope where there had once been only desolation. "Funny," he commented to Claire on one of these morning walks. "I spent 47 years thinking I needed to prove my worth through financial success. But my true worth was in the ability to transform challenges into opportunities, rejection into motivation, and personal suffering into service to others." Claire held his hand. "Marcus, you didn't just transform this land. You transformed yourself, and in transforming yourself, you transformed the lives of thousands of people." It was a profound observation that perfectly summarized Marcus's journey. He had started as a victim of circumstances, but chose to become an agent of change. He had transformed personal humiliation into social purpose, isolation into community, and apparent failure into true success. The story of the rocky land became a legend in the region and beyond. Schools used the case to teach about citizenship and social responsibility. Universities studied the organizational model developed by Marcus. Other NGOs adapted the methodologies created by the organization. But for Marcus, the most important thing wasn't the external recognition. It was knowing that thousands of families were reunited, children were in loving homes, the elderly were cared for with dignity, and the sick received proper treatment because of the work that began with the discovery of wet letters in a river. On his 70th birthday, Marcus received a special tribute. Hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the NGO's work gathered on the rocky land for a celebration that lasted all day. Families formed through adoptions, facilitated by the organization, young people who grew up in the orphanage and were now successful adults, institutions that had been saved from closure through connections made via the Transparency Network. Among those present was Emma, the girl who had asked Marcus if he knew any family who wanted a daughter. Now a 25-year-old teacher, she brought her own young daughter to meet the man who had changed her life. "Uncle Marcus," she said, using the affectionate term she had kept over the years, "this is Sophia, my daughter. I wanted her to meet the man who gave me a family." Marcus was moved as he held little Sophia in his arms. It was the closing of a cycle. The orphan girl he had helped find a family was now a mother and was passing forward the love she had received. The celebration included musical performances by the children from the orphanage, speeches from local and national authorities, and testimonials from people helped by the NGO. But the most memorable moment was when Michelle Stevens announced a special surprise. "Marcus, over 20 years of our NGO's work, we've managed to document over 10,000 lives directly impacted by our projects. But we know the real impact is much greater, because every life we transform creates ripples that reach other people." Michelle revealed a panel with photos and stories of the organization's main achievements over the years. It was an impressive mosaic of smiling faces, reunited families, revitalized institutions, and strengthened communities. "This panel will be permanently displayed in the Transparency Museum," continued Michelle, "but not as a monument to what has already been done, as inspiration for everything we can still do." Marcus looked at the panel with tears in his eyes. Each photo represented a story of overcoming, a reunited family, a child who found love, an elderly person who received dignity. It was the visual summary of a life dedicated to service. "When I found those first letters in the river," he said in his thank you speech, "I had no idea I was starting a journey that would change not only my life, but the lives of so many others. I learned that there is no useless land, only people who haven't yet discovered how to cultivate hope where others see only stones." Marcus looked at Claire, who smiled proudly beside him, then at Sister Catherine, now 80 years old but still present and active, at Michelle and the entire new generation of NGO leaders, at the hundreds of friendly faces in the crowd. "What I've learned on this journey is that true success isn't measured by what we accumulate, but by what we plant. Not by what we keep, but by what we share. Not by what we achieve for ourselves, but by what we make possible for others." The party continued late into the night, with music, dancing, and many conversations about the past and plans for the future. Marcus circulated among the guests, renewing friendships, listening to stories of how the NGO's work had continued to impact lives and being moved by the accounts of transformation. When the celebration finally ended and the last guests left, Marcus and Claire were alone on the property, watching the stars in the clear country sky. The silence was broken only by the gentle sound of the river that had changed everything. "Claire, do you believe it all started with my brothers trying to humiliate me with this land?" "I believe it all started with you having the courage to turn humiliation into opportunity," she replied. "The land was just land. The transformation came from your choice to do something positive with what you received." Marcus smiled. It was a perspective that helped him understand his own journey. He hadn't been lucky to find letters in the river. He had been brave to investigate when he could have ignored them. He hadn't been lucky to uncover a criminal scheme. He had been persistent in seeking justice when he could have looked the other way. "You know what makes me proudest in this whole story?" asked Marcus. What? It's that we managed to prove that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences. I was just a middle-aged man who had failed at several businesses. Anthony was a retiree with no resources. Sister Catherine was a nun caring for orphans in a house that needed repairs. But together, we managed to create something that transformed thousands of lives. Claire held his hand. Marcus, you all achieved that because you looked beyond the limitations. You saw possibilities where others saw only problems. In the following years, Marcus remained involved with the NGO as an advisor, but spent more time dedicating himself to his personal life and reflections on his journey. He wrote a book telling his story, with all proceeds from sales directed to social projects. The book became a national success, inspiring many people who felt like failures or without purpose to seek ways to contribute to their communities. Marcus received letters from readers across the country, many sharing how the story had motivated them to make positive changes in their own lives. One of the most striking letters came from a 40-year-old man from New York who had lost his job and was going through a divorce. Inspired by Marcus's story, he began doing volunteer work at a homeless shelter and discovered a calling he never knew he had. 2 years later, he had created his own NGO focused on the social reintegration of vulnerable people. Marcus, he wrote, your story showed me that there is no wrong age to discover our true purpose. Thank you for proving it's never too late to start over. Letters like this arrived regularly, each telling a story of transformation inspired by Marcus's journey. He personally responded to all of them, offering encouragement and practical advice based on his experience. The Rocky Ground had become a pilgrimage destination for people seeking inspiration or guidance for social projects. Marcus and Claire received visitors regularly, always willing to share their experiences and offer guidance. It's important for people to understand, Marcus would often tell these visitors, that there is no magic formula for transforming lives. There is only the willingness to start where you are, with what you have, and do the next right thing. Michelle Stevens, now with 10 years of leadership at the NGO, had expanded the organization's reach even further. Under her direction, the Transparency Network had become national, connecting thousands of social organizations across the country. The methods developed on the Rocky Ground were now studied in universities and adapted for different cultural and geographical contexts. Marcus created more than an NGO, Michelle commented in an interview about the organization's legacy. He created a model of how ordinary people can generate extraordinary impact when they combine personal courage with social commitment. At 75, Marcus finally began to feel the weight of age. He was no longer able to maintain the intense pace of activities from previous years, but remained mentally sharp and emotionally engaged with the social work. Claire, now 70, had also scaled back her activities, but both remained present and influential in the life of the NGO. It was during this time that Marcus decided to create one final initiative, a mentorship program for middle-aged people who wanted to find purpose in the second half of life. Based on his own experience of discovering his calling at 47, the program offered guidance, resources, and a support network for people in career transition or searching for meaning. Many people think certain ages are too late for big changes, Marcus explained in the program's presentation. My own life is proof that the best years can come after 50, if we're willing to embrace new challenges and purposes. The mentorship program became extremely popular, attracting participants from various parts of the country. Marcus personally mentored some cases, but most were guided by a network of volunteers who had undergone similar transformations in their own lives. One of the most remarkable success stories was that of Grace Patterson, a 60-year-old retired nurse who had felt lost after leaving the profession. Inspired by Marcus's example, she created a home care program for needy seniors, which quickly expanded to several cities. Marcus showed me that retirement doesn't mean the end of contribution, said Grace at a mentoring program meeting. It means the freedom to contribute in the way we truly want. The mentoring work brought a new dimension of satisfaction to Marcus, seeing people from his own generation discovering purposes and creating positive impacts was like multiplying his own transformation. Each success story validated his belief that it's never too late to make a difference. Claire watched Marcus's continued involvement with admiration and occasional concern. "Marcus, you don't need to save the whole world," she would joke. "You've already done your part." "Claire, I'm not trying to save the world," he would reply. "I'm just sharing what I've learned so other people can save their own pieces of the world." It was a philosophy that perfectly summarized Marcus's approach to social activism. He never saw himself as a savior or hero, but as a facilitator of transformations that other people carried out in their own lives and communities. When Marcus turned 80, the celebration was even bigger than his 70th. The NGO had become one of the main references for transparency and efficiency in the Brazilian third sector. The model developed on the rocky terrain had been adapted and implemented in dozens of countries, always with positive results. Representatives from international organizations came to the celebration, recognizing Marcus as a pioneer in methodologies that had revolutionized social work in various parts of the world. But for Marcus, the most important recognition continued to be the personal stories of transformation. During the party, he received a special gift, an album with letters from thousands of people whose lives had been impacted directly or indirectly by the work that began with the discovery of the correspondence in the river. There were letters from children who had been adopted, parents who had found children, elderly who had received care, sick people who had been treated, and young people who had been inspired by the story to create their own social projects. Marcus spent hours reading the letters, moved by each story. It was the tangible summary of a life dedicated to service, the concrete proof that his choices had generated waves of transformation that extended far beyond what he could have imagined. "Claire," he said the night after the celebration, "when I look back, I see that the greatest wealth I've accumulated wasn't material possessions but relationships. It wasn't fame, but the knowledge of having contributed to something bigger than myself." Claire smiled. "Marcus, you've achieved something few people do. You completely transformed the meaning of success in your own life." It was a profound observation. Marcus had started by measuring success with the conventional ruler of wealth accumulation and social status. He ended up measuring success by the positive impact generated in other people's lives. It was a perspective transformation that had changed not only his life, but the lives of thousands of others. In the final years of his life, Marcus became an almost mythical figure in the region. Children grew up hearing stories about the man who had transformed a field of stones into a center of hope. Universities offered courses on the organizational methods he had developed. Governments consulted the NGO for public policies related to the third sector, but Marcus remained humble and accessible. He continued to receive visitors in his simple home on the property, always willing to talk about his journey and offer advice to people seeking purpose. "The most important thing I learned," he would often tell these visitors, "is that we don't need perfect conditions to start making a difference. We just need to start with what we have, where we are, and trust that the path reveals itself as we walk." It was a philosophy tested by his own experience. Marcus had started with just a rocky plot of land and wet letters. He ended up creating a legacy that would benefit future generations. The transformation had happened one step at a time, one right decision at a time, one person helped at a time. The river that cut through the land kept flowing, but now its waters were crystal clear. The stones that once seemed like obstacles had become foundations for buildings that housed projects of hope. The place that was given as a joke had become a symbol of transformation and possibility. Marcus often looked at the river, remembering the day he found the first yellow bag floating among the stones. It was hard to believe such a simple discovery had triggered so many changes. But perhaps that was exactly the lesson. The greatest transformations often begin with the smallest acts of courage and awareness. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this moving story of overcoming and courage. Marcus proved that it's never too late to find our true purpose in life, turning humiliation into motivation and a rejected plot of land into a center of hope. Leave in the comments. Do you believe Marcus made the right decisions? Which part of the story moved you the most? Your sincere words are very important to us. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories.